song will be number 209. Number 209.
Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you here and nice to be your speaker tonight. So as you can see on the board, I'm going to talk about Miriam tonight. I'm continuing with the study that I started a few weeks ago about women of faith in the Bible. And so previously, we've done a study on Mary and Martha, the tale of two sisters, and we kind of saw the way they both spoke and reacted differently to Jesus, in their lives and those stories. And we talked about Mary Magdalene last time, and that was also great to learn from the gratitude that she had in her example that we saw in the ministry that she was with Jesus during that time. And so tonight we're going to study another woman, obviously, and the woman of faith, Miriam, the woman who helped save a nation. And what I hope to illustrate in this study is that even though she's not perfect, I'm going to turn this down a little bit. Sorry, it sounds a little loud to me. Even though she's not perfect, she shows a great hope and commitment through her actions. And so that's what we're going to look at. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably really excited that I'm not giving another lesson tonight on Mary, right? It's 2 in a row, Marys, all right? Well, I'm going to go ahead and spoil the surprise. Miriam is the original Mary. All right, so that's the first thing we're going to learn tonight, is that even though I'm not talking about Mary, I am talking about Miriam, the people after which all of the Marys are named. So it's the most original form of the name Mary, and so any name like that, Maria, Mary, Miriam, and so forth, is all the same. It all reflects back to her. And so we're going to learn tonight about the first example of what the idea of Mary can be, if that's a reasonable way to say that. So for tonight's study, there's not very many verses, but I'm always surprised at how much we can learn about the character of a person in just a few short verses. It's pretty cool. And so tonight, I think literally there's like 9 verses that we'll read about Miriam, and we're still going to try to learn a little bit about her character. Now, for the study of Miriam, we're going to go way back in time. We're going to go back to Egypt in the year 1525 BC. All right? So for all of you doing math, that's 3,529 years ago. So we're going way back. And we're going to read from Exodus 2 to introduce our study, our person tonight, Miriam. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child in it, set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile, and his sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her female attendants walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her slave woman, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a woman for you who's nursing from the Hebrew women, so that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew. And she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now I realize you know the story of the birth of the baby boy Moses. And while not named immediately, interesting in this story, we know from 1 Chronicles 6, verse 3, that the children of Amram, that's Moses' dad, are Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. So the references we just looked at are about Miriam. And at this time, what we have is that Miriam is assumed to be approximately age 9, 10 or so, something like that, maybe as old as 12, but somewhere between 9 and 12. Aaron is 3 years old, and of course Moses is somewhere between 0 and 3 months. He's the new baby in the story. And so what we're going to look at, what's really going on. And I know most of you know this, but again, to set the story, to set the tone, to set the emotion of why I think it's significant of what Miriam does here is described for us in Exodus 1. And we learn that the Pharaoh, of course, is really having some great difficulty seeing the growth of the Egyptian people. When Egypt first allowed the Israelites to come into the nation, it was under good circumstances. Everybody, you recognize this, that Joseph brought them in. He was the man in charge. Everything was fine. It was 430 years prior, and the relationship was great. But what has happened is that in Exodus 1:8, we get the summary here that a new king who knew nothing of Joseph rose to power in Egypt. And he said to his people, see, the Israelite people have multiplied and become more numerous than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them to stop their increase. And if you look back at the math here, Egypt, may have had 1 or 2 million people in its population of just the Egyptians. And while they occupied obviously a large area, the Israelites had been given the land of Goshen, which is right there next to the Nile as well, and up in that delta area. So pretty good farmland and very useful for them. And what they did is they just grew, and God multiplied them, and they kept growing and growing. When Joseph and his people had originally come, there were 70 of them. Okay, 70 people. And by the time the census is taken in Exodus 30, there's 600,000 people. And that's pretty reasonable growth over 400 years. I think I read it is about 2%, maybe 2.5, so it's on the upper ends of normal population growth. But again, they've got everything they need here, plus good weather and whatever, everything supporting their growth. So the Pharaoh says, we got to stop this because they're going to challenge us if we're not careful. And so he has a 2-part plan. And so the first part is he is going to make them work harder. And I don't actually know everything they've been doing up to this point, but in general he says that we need to make a construction labor force out of the Israelites. And he sets captains over portions of them like supervisors and puts them in labor teams, and they start building these military cities and Pithom and Ramses. It's all in Exodus there. And he tries to make, what the Bible says, he tries to make life bitter for them. And Exodus 1:13 says, so the Egyptians reduced the Israelites to cruel slavery, making life bitter for them with hard labor at mortar and brick and all kinds of field work, cruelly oppressed in their labor, trying to keep the men away from home so they have less babies, right? That's the whole plan here in general. But he has a part 2 of the plan. And remember, I'm giving a lesson about Miriam. I'm trying to establish the sort of context in which we're looking at her. So the next part is Pharaoh has a plan. He sees that the problem is population. Okay, and so much like Bill Gates, he says the people and the number of people are the actual problem. And so how are we going to solve this? Women's reproductive services is what he comes up with. And so Pharaoh decides to go talk to all of the midwives, and it lists 2 of them here, Shiphrah and Puah. And he says, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. And so this is kind of, I guess, a personal private decree where the Pharaoh actually goes and talks to the midwives and says, do this. But it's not yet a universal decree. That happens a few verses later after the midwives kind of are able to shield and save many babies from this fate. But Pharaoh observes this and he's like, what's going on? And so later he gives a final decree and says, then Pharaoh gave his order to all the people, every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Okay? And so this is what is stated and sets the context for why we're introduced to Miriam and the situation in the first place. The world that Miriam is growing up in is not easy. Who knows how much sadness she had endured and seen from her fellow Israelite people with baby boys being, literally thrown into the Nile. No one knows exactly how many were killed. And it's not illustrated for us exactly how long this decree lasts. But we know it's at least 3 months, otherwise they would have said, hey, Pharaoh's easing up, it should be fine. But they're still concerned after 3 months. And so, based on whatever, you do the math, but based on 600,000 people and a 2% growth, you're talking something like 500 baby boys maybe born a month or so. And so you're talking hundreds and maybe into the thousands of baby boys that were killed at this time. So it's a huge problem. It's got to be a lot of sadness, a lot of things that Miriam was affected by and was aware of. But in the middle of that sadness, there's also hope. And so we learn a little bit here and there through the Bible about the faith of the parents. And Moses and Miriam's mom was named Jochebed, and the dad was Amram, as we read. And we learned this from Numbers 26:59, listed there. And as we read earlier, Jochebed, when Moses was born, she looked at him and said, well, he's beautiful, I think I'll keep him. But the more important thing is, why were they not afraid? Why were they not concerned about this decree? Well, Stephen, I have to jump around to find a lot of this story here, but Stephen talked about this a little bit when he was talking to the Sanhedrin court. And he said, he, the Egyptian Pharaoh, dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. And other translations say that he was beautiful to God and that he was well-pleasing to God. And so I think it's most likely the case that the proper interpretation of Exodus 2 is not just that Jochebed, thought, he looks like me, beautiful, but more so, they knew that he had a purpose. And whether or not this is on supernatural inspiration, which actually some Jewish records allude to, but it's not in the Bible, but there is a purpose that they knew that he was meant for, to free the people. And so, with that belief and purpose, she waited as long as she could before she made this basket covered with pitch. And in case that sounds familiar, by the way, there are really only 2 places in the Bible that pitch is mentioned. Number 1, the ark that saved the 8 after the flood. And the second is this little basket that Jochebed made for Moses. And so actually, we get sort of like 2 for 1, right? The other woman of faith in this series tonight is also Jochebed, because she was faithful enough to build this fancy little thing so that she could craftily comply with Pharaoh's order and say, sure, I threw him into the Nile in a tiny mini waterproof ark, so at least he could survive for a while. But she had faith, and she knew that things would work out. Now, as you're probably also, I missed a verse. No, I'll get there in a second, I think. Okay. No, I didn't miss a verse. Okay. So, additionally, in Hebrews, okay, Hebrews 11:23, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because, again, they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And so, I think we can conjecture here that why were they not afraid? Because they knew before, Stephen ever knew, they knew what would come of Moses. And they knew before the writer of Hebrews knew what would happen with Moses. And so I think that what I'm trying to do is build a case for the fact that Miriam was able to also share in her parents' faith. And she most likely heard about all of these stories and the thoughts and the prayers that were probably ongoing in Amram and Jochebed's life, and she could see their faith. And perhaps she also shared in that and said, well, my brother must be special. And so I think this is the kind of thought process that brings her to the point where she is willing to step out and bother the princess in the middle of bath time, which could otherwise be awkward, right? And so with Moses crying and all this, she steps out and says, hey, I have an idea. What if I go get a Hebrew woman? And so she does this, and it works out exceptionally well for Jochebed, because she now gets paid to nurse her own baby, and Moses gets the upbringing in their family. And then on top of that, the thoughts are here that most likely you're not talking about him being raised for, just 8 months or something like that. But we know from other verses, of course, that Moses had a deep awareness of the one true God. And so it is very likely that he was in that family for years, maybe, 8, 9, 10 years, where he was able to fortify that relationship with Miriam and with Aaron and with their parents. Because we know that while Moses spent all that time in Egypt, he was not willing to live that life in Egypt forever. So we think there's a lot of time that happened before he's handed off to the daughter of Pharaoh to become an Egyptian. So even though that is not specifically recorded. And so, to keep our story focused on Miriam, I have to do some quick synopsizing because it does skip around and the verses are limited. But, Moses, meanwhile, right, he goes off to Egypt. He's there for 40 years. He learns all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Okay? Fighting, the riding horses, whatever, all the stuff they do. And then he's reunited in Egypt. And the Lord speaks to Moses. The Lord speaks to Aaron and says, go into the wilderness, meet Moses. So he met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say and about the signs that he commanded him to perform. And as you are well aware, this then introduces them to the time they spend talking to Pharaoh and the 10 plagues that occur, the 10th being the death angel, which is also the creation of the Passover that occurs at that time. And it's kind of interesting that obviously the death and destruction that night was tremendous. And it says in the middle of the night, Pharaoh came to them and said, leave, just go, get out of here. And so these 600,000 Israelites start their journey, and it leads them, God specifically leads them right to the Red Sea, okay? Not the most normal path, but again, the story. They faced a great impasse And meanwhile, Pharaoh changes his mind, of course, and chases them with 250,000 military men. The people are filled with doubt, but Moses encourages them. He says, the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still. And it's a great story where God makes safe passage for the Israelites for hours and hours. You know, it says that the walls of water are up all night long through this. And the Egyptians, of course, feel some kind of supernatural security. They figure, I'll try to go through there too. And God, of course, waits until the Israelites are safe. And then he lowers the water down on the Egyptians. So Exodus 14:28, the water returned, covering the chariots, chariot drivers, and all the king's army that had followed the Israelites into the sea, and not one of them survived. Now, it's after this that we're reintroduced to Miriam at this time, okay? She enters the time stream of the story. And so after this amazing triumph and exodus over the Egyptian military, hundreds of thousands of Egyptian military, Moses leads the men in song, and it's called the Song of Moses in chapter 15 of Exodus. And then in verse 20, it says, then Aaron's sister Miriam, a prophetess, took a tambourine in her hand. All the women followed her, playing tambourines and dancing. And Miriam told them, sing to the Lord, because he is worthy of great honor. He has thrown the horse and its rider into the sea. Right, the obvious reference to the victory over the Egyptians. And so this set of verses, again, while small, tells us a couple of things. Number one, she's really fit because she's 90 years old at this time, okay? But she's ready to just grab a tambourine and start dancing and leading the women in song. And so that's pretty special. But again, the overarching point is that she is a leading woman. We learn she is a prophetess, okay? She's influential among the women there and listed as a prophetess. And this is a rare honor, right, for a woman. And as I understand, it's only given to a few others: Deborah, Huldah, Anna, the wife of Isaiah, and the daughters of Philip. So pretty awesome thing for her to be this prophetess, and also, of course, Moses and Aaron prophets. This is confirmed separately in Micah 6:4, where it says, I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. And so while we see, while we have limited information, we see glimpses of who she was and what she was about. A woman thankful for what God had done, a woman ready to lead others in praise, or specifically lead women in praise of God. And though her song is brief, it shows a focus on God and all that he had done. And no doubt this is a reflection and outpouring of the very hope that she had had 80 years before, when she stood on the banks of the Nile and stepped out to the princess at that time. Now, again, stepping forward in time, we're going to talk about an interesting scenario that I've titled "The Conflict in the Wilderness." And this is a moment of conflict, a bad decision that she makes, and the consequences that surround this. And what I think is important, in a character study, is to recognize the fact that obviously none of the characters that we study in the Bible are perfect, except for Jesus, right? And so we're going to find here that obviously Miriam is also not perfect. And so what happens in this set of verses is that they decide to criticize Moses about his wife. All right, and we'll just read it here. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman who he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Is it a fact that the Lord has spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well?" Which is true, because again, she's a prophetess. Aaron shares in the prophetic ability as well. Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard this. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any person who was on the face of the earth. So what we have here is really two issues. One, they're bringing up the fact that they have an issue with his wife. Okay, that's number one. But the other issue here is that they have a real sense of pride. And even though they're all prophets, I guess, they're asking for a sense of equality. And so that's the other problem in their request. They want to be like similar status. And this is a really interesting response from the Lord, who, by the way, doesn't even address the wife thing. He just goes right to the point. And he says, he calls them out to meet with them. "You three go out to the tent of meeting." So the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent. And he called Aaron and Miriam. When they had both come forward, he said, "Now hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak with him in a dream." But listen to this. "It is not this way for my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth." That is, openly, and not using mysterious language. "And he beholds the form of the Lord. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses?" This is really interesting because, like I said, the first question, and almost like a trivial side note, is, I don't like the fact that Moses married a Cushite woman. But the bigger problem is they're saying, aren't I as good as Moses? Aren't I the same? And God clearly says, while you're both or all prophets, see Moses as different, and he illustrates exactly the way in which he sees this. "And the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he departed. But when the cloud had withdrawn from above the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow. As Aaron turned toward Miriam, behold, she was leprous. Then Aaron said to Moses, 'O my Lord, I beg you, do not hold us responsible for the sin by which we have turned out to be foolish, and by which we have sinned. Oh, do not let her be like a dead person whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb.' So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, 'God, heal her, please.'" So, it's interesting, right? They repent immediately as soon as this happens. They say, we've sinned. What have we done? Please heal Miriam. And of course the question is raised, why only Miriam? Why isn't Aaron, attacked with, or afflicted with leprosy? And the best reasonable outcome is that perhaps in this case, maybe since Miriam's name is mentioned first in the dialogue, originally, maybe she's the one who brought it up, and thus was dealt the greater sentence here. But we don't know for sure. But either way, the request is heard by God, and he reduces the sentence to 7 days of leprosy, during which time Miriam is forced to live outside the camp, away from any contact of others, and out of understanding and respect, of course, the entire tent camp just stops for 7 days, and they wait until that time is done before they move on. So quite a big situation caused here, again, by this trivial claim and by this question of why can't I be like him, right? At this moment. And it's also kind of bizarre when you realize that now at this point, Miriam is 91. Okay, she's like a feisty 91-year-old. And Aaron's 84, and they're making this claim against Moses and Zipporah, who've now been married 41 years. So I recognize they've only been around for like a year, and they're probably, just kind of talking through these things, but it's still, out of place and an unreasonable request that they've made. But the good part here is that after this, there's no more complaints or issues that are recorded, and by such, I think we can, interpret that Miriam stays consistent in belief in God and support of Moses from this time onward. The last information we have about Miriam is in Numbers chapter 20 regarding her death. It says there in Numbers 20 verse 1, "Then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there." It notes the first month here, but it doesn't give a year. However, if you kind of look through the approximate schedule and breakdown and run through that and some other scholars that I looked at, it's pretty well understood that this is the first month of the 40th year of the wilderness wandering. So it's right at the end. And so in fact, Numbers 20 through Numbers 36 all occur in 1 year, actually, as you read through that. And in this same year, again, Miriam dies in the first month, Aaron dies in the 5th month of this year, and then Moses dies in the 11th month of this year. And so, if I've got my math right, Miriam lives to 131, Aaron 123, and Moses 120 years. And what's really interesting is in character studies, typically we don't get to see a person's entire life, usually, okay? When we're looking at Mary Magdalene, it's just, we don't even know how old she is, right? We look at Mary Magdalene and we get to see roughly 3 years of her life, and many other stories are like that. But we get to see, 120 of Miriam's 131 years, generally speaking, which is pretty good. And Miriam had quite a long life and held true to her faith, except for that 91st year. But otherwise, she was respected and honored. And while it's not in the Bible, Jewish historian Josephus says that the people celebrated her death with a public funeral followed by 30 straight days of mourning. And that's why the Bible references they stopped there in Kadesh at that point. So, what are a few things that we can learn from Miriam tonight? Again, not very much information, but we can learn a couple things. God values young people. It's clear that Miriam's first role in our story is when she is barely or around 10 years old. Yet, because of her strong basis in faith and her committed parents, she saw where she could fulfill a role. She didn't, demand something of the princess, but she asked, hey, could I find a Hebrew woman? And in that little way, helped to save her people, or played her part in saving her people. Number 2 is hope. Miriam was clearly raised in a situation under that national oppression where, we don't have to deal with that today. I guess some in the world do, obviously, but she's raised in this envelope of national oppression where they could never have continued to succeed as Egypt continued to levy greater problems for them. It could have been very easy for her to lose hope, to give up and say, well, this will never change. But she had the hope that I believe was passed on by her parents for that possibility of a greater future. And Miriam didn't forget. She listened, she understood God's plan and how she could help in that as well. Another one is selfishness. Miriam showed selfishness for the majority of her life. She cared about her family and her brother. She understood the promised role And even after that one misstep of selfishness, she quickly recovered, she repented, and apparently carried out another 30 plus years of successful life after that. And lastly, Miriam set an example for a popular name. I mean, it is like, even in today's world, right, it's the most popular female name, or at least number 2. But all of the Marys are named after Miriam. Miriam, by the way, means bitter, I believe, under standard interpretation. I don't know if that just is a reference to the original stress that she was under. It's not really easily understood, but that's what it means. But all of these other people, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary Bethany, Mary, sister of Martha, Mary, the mother of James, Mary, the mother of John Mark, and in Romans, a lady named Mary of Rome, right? It's all over the place. And so all of these people and the Marys that we know have, at least in some way, a connection back to this Miriam, who we met as a young 10-year-old girl tonight. So that is my lesson for tonight. I hope it's been helpful to learn something about Miriam. While she's not perfect, she showed great faith. And I think that's important. As Michael, showed this morning, I just forgot which verse it was in Titus, but we are not here because we're great people, okay? We're not in church because we're great. But God saved us because we need saving. And so none of us are perfect, just like we learned about tonight. But what does it take? We have to be able to see where we've erred. And we have to be able to see how we can align ourselves with God and to repent and live that changed life. And so tonight, as a matter of, an invitation, I hope that something has been in this lesson that might, touch your heart if you are in that need of becoming a new member of Christ. And you can do that by confessing the name of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and being immersed for the remission of your sins. And if you need other prayers to the church, then at this time, we welcome you to come forward while we stand and sing.
Let the door is set.